Good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you may find yourself. My name is Rick Kelly, and you'll notice on the tag underneath my picture, or me, it says Yvonne Kelly. Well, she's got the premium in this household, and I got the basic. It turns out I have two titles for my presentation. One is Restoring Restorative Practices for Education. The other was Windows, Lenses, and Mirrors. Regardless, they all lead to the same place, which is what I want to talk about is let's not make the same mistakes again in education. And we can open windows, we can use a variety of different lenses, but most importantly, what we need to do is hold up a mirror to ourselves to reflect our own practices and how we locate ourselves in this work. So let me begin by acknowledging my social location and also the power and privilege I have as a white cisgendered male. I am uninvited on these lands, which are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe. They are comprised of the three nations of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And together they comprise the Three Fires Confederacy. I'm likely not choosing to be here, but my great aunt Lyd, who came over from Ireland in 1917 by boat, is no longer with us. So I can't really get the backstory. I can imagine, given what was going on in Ireland at that time. And also, in colonial settler terms, where I live is called Tottenham. And Tottenham is about 80 kilometers north of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Toronto is part of a huge Greater Toronto area and extends even further. Toronto is also described by a number of urban planners as the place that has three cities. And those three cities reflect what's described as neighborhood apartheidism, which is a function of the ghettoization of poverty and the racialization of poverty. Those are the places where I've typically worked. I grew up in Toronto, it's my hood, and those are the places that I've worked in as a youth worker, restorative justice practitioner, employee of school boards, and a variety of other things. So I'm attempting to be an alongside-er and a disruptor, while at the same time acknowledging that I have some dead angles. So this is kind of the cycle of topics I want to touch on, moving towards a restorative ecosystem. So first of all, I want to talk about some stone soup stories. Then I want to look at challenges to education around transformation, abolition, and decolonizing it, problematizing restorative practices, pull from a tale of three school boards that are near and dear to me, and then talking about an ecosystem paradigm and finding our niche, and then creating a synthesis of a number of different paradigms and ways of looking at things, which hopefully will take us to solutions. As the Cheshire cat says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So any discussion of relational practice in education needs to begin with a discussion of the purposes of education. But I'm going to leave that for the moment, and we'll come back to that. So let's move over to some story times. And just as a reminder, improvement is the enemy of change. That kind of sums up some of my thinking, which is what I'm looking at is not incremental changes. Well, they can be significant in the lives of individuals. What I'm looking at is change that's larger. So, story time. A number of us have gathered around the virtual kitchen table here and across the pond under what's been called and what we're calling the Stone Soup Initiative. We're centering the voices of individuals and communities for the transformation of education. And we're doing that by pulling from our various experiences, some of which are evident and some of which are hidden stories. So I'm just going to give a few snippets from the first 4 chapters. Chapter 1, the school is a hub of the community, 1990 to actually 2021, set in Rexdale, a section of Toronto in Canada. The first question is, how could a project, of which there were 8 of them, and only one was the school as a hub project, working with kids ages 4 to 8, end up lasting to this day, past the 4 years that it was intended to exist. And that's because of the community. What were these projects? They were crafted in early 1990 through 3 ministries of the provincial government to create a template and investigate the impacts of early investment in children in terms of their well-being and their outcomes down the road. It was a 25-year longitudinal research demonstration project aimed at generating policy. And it had 5 pillars. It was to be ecological, integrate services at a local level, be holistic in terms of the students or children, be community-based, and be universal. So the pictures here are what you see of the community and actually how it was community-based. The idea behind it being community-based was not simply to be located in the community and acknowledging it as a school of 1,000 children up to the ages of grade 5 with 18 portables, but it was actually to give ownership, power, and decision-making to parents, residents in the community. And that was the case. They had 51% representation on all committees, including the steering committee. And that's how it ended up being a project, an initiative that continues to this day. Because when the community got hold of it, they said, this is good, this works for us. Chapter 1, page 2, from the inside out and outside in. When it came to creating the school as a hub in the community and of the community, we had 2 systems come together, the school and the community. And the opportunity existed to have a flow from the school out into the community and vice versa, community into the school. This is just some of the spatial activities that took place. That empty field there became a water park. We built ramps so that grandparents with preschoolers and school age and parents could actually access the portables. We built playgrounds, numerous. These ones were located in the local social housing, which was where many of our families lived. And that was part of a community audit that looked at the quality of the play spaces and just the physical spaces there. So we built playscapes. We assessed the quality of the underground parking, found that there was many lights that didn't work, broken cars, many walls throughout the neighborhood that provided shelter for illicit activities. And all of those were addressed through partnerships. With the school, there was a number who wanted to enhance the teaching. One of the science teachers wanted to have a wetland. And so we worked together and once again pulled in community resources and built a wetland. And like anything that begins that has a resonating effect, that went from a wetlands to looking at the nearby Humber River, which ran beside it, and decided we need to clean that up. And so we did. We pulled out over 32 shopping carts and actually began a process of refurbishing the river so that even the ducks were happy. And lastly, communities need spaces that are safe, and they need spaces in the school. So we created a community room for the parents, grandparents who are waiting, volunteering, working, taking kids to school, so that they had a place as well in the school. Chapter 2, bringing stones to your teacher, not an apple. Uganda, 2005 to 2006. Gentleman down the bottom there, Stephen Hull, who teaches at Staffordshire University, was part of a global teachers initiative, and he went to Uganda. One of the problems was the state of the school that needed to be rebuilt. And so he came up with the idea with local group of teachers, community members, and said, well, why don't we build a school? And how we could do that is by asking the children to bring stones to the school. Social Innovation Hub, Chapter 3. This was located in School of Community Services at George Brown College. It was an early stage incubator and connector for the generation of innovative ideas, projects, and social enterprises. It was based on restorative and transformational pedagogy that was directed towards praxis, and social justice. And out of this, a number of initiatives were generated. One component of the Social Innovation Hub, which allowed students to come in with a passion, often based out of lived experience. In the case of the Restorative Center, spurred on by advanced training that students from the 3-year program had undertaken, and gave them an opportunity to turn that into purpose, into workshops, activities, innovations. So just a few that came from this. 2 students developed Fostering Peace, a Restorative Mindset Kit. The focus of this initiative was, first of all, to train and role model for grade 6s how to be peaceful peacemakers, how to be in circle, how to build talking pieces, and how to take that out into the larger school. Spontaneously, they even ran their own circle. It moved out into the larger school grounds where there was actually 2 schools on the same property. And because one was designated a sort of quasi-private school, there was naturally antipathy between the 2 school communities. The students developed 20 different workshops that were activity-based that really were intended to build relationships and foster well-being between the groups of students. A number of the students in the Innovation Hub, usually 25 at a time from 4 to 8 months at any point in time over 4 years, when they saw what was happening in the Restorative Center, they got the bug around what is this? And part of it was by the role modeling of Daniel in the far corner there, who's giving you the, and they took and asked for training around restorative practices and how they could integrate it in their own work. There was probably over 120 students trained over a period of 2 years. Another student took the idea of what's called People's University Cafe, which takes conversations out into the community and has them with normal citizens. And the conversations she had were around restorative justice. What do they know about it? What do they think about it? Where do they think they could, place it into their life? Another group decided to create restorative zones in a high school and provide safe spaces for students there who were dealing with whatever in their day-to-day, adversity, conflict, those sorts of things. This was also a school that was slated to school at the end of the year. So there was a high degree of anxiety and upset around this process. So it was well-timed and well-placed. Daniel, again, on the far corner with others, decided to build on an initiative that we had mounted for community service students, but then offer this to high school students. We had been running a play called Tough Case, which was a restorative play written by a local playwright, but initially profiled in Nova Scotia. And we brought him back into Toronto, and we offered the play to 300 high school students. Daniel undertook the logistics around that and then trained 20 of his peers to offer backup workshops or follow-up workshops with the students in smaller groups so they could talk about what they'd seen and what they made sense of in terms of their experience with seeing this being applied to a 16-year-old young boy who was facing charges but had many other issues in his life. This was a particularly larger initiative. It was called Towards a Higher Journey. Simone, in the middle there, was a mature mother who came into the program in 2012. At the end of her first year, her 15-year-old son was murdered. She lives in a community where there's high degrees of violence. And there have been other similar incidents before and after her son's murder. She took some time off, but she had something deeper within her that said, we need to respond differently to young people, because it was oftentimes young people involved in senseless acts of violence. And so she began a process in the community to work with them around their own healing and her own, and then came into the Innovation Hub and said, I want to build a community center. Since I've been involved in a number of actual building of programs and actually buildings like health centers, I said to Simone, sounds great. It should only take 5 to 10 years and you've got 8 months. But the intent behind any of the projects was not necessarily always to achieve completion, but to create a template and a model for something that could be implemented later on. She moved from there into work after her 3 years at the college and began working with an agency called Toronto Community Benefits, who were engaged with what was called Metrolinks, which creates and builds all transit throughout the region. And with them, they were able to secure 32 meters of frontage for the building of a community center. So, victory. Except this summer, they reneged on the promise. What happens though is when you go back on a promise with a community that's well organized and has a strong voice, that doesn't go over that well, and it didn't. So they had to renege their renege, recommit to building this, put it on paper, apologize for their inability to listen, and which also then elicited, ironically, our conservative government to ensure and guarantee that this land would be committed for the building of a community center. So as it is now, slated, shovels in the ground date is 2023. So we're only 2 years short of what I initially thought would take 10 years. As I think many of you know, anything that has a restorative element to it often has a rippling effect to it. Simone's work with working on building a community center that was dedicated to peacemaking and peace building continued on in her work with the agency that she was now employed with, Toronto Community Benefits. Their mandate is to ensure whenever there's infrastructure builds that communities actually benefit through both employment, which meant 10% of hires of a labor force of 3,000 for one project, and that there would also be other benefits like procurements. The provincial government came out with an offer to fund programs for Black youth. And when I saw that, I approached Simone and the director and I said, here's a great opportunity for us to craft a program based on relational, restorative, and peacemaking circle processes that the fundamental focus would be to create pathways for Black youth into the trades, who would be mentored by journeymen who had dealt with, and the focus was racism, and also the challenge to become tradesmen. When I talk about racism, it's two very graphic indicators. One is the underrepresentation of Black persons in the trades. The other thing is what we saw since late spring up until 2 weeks ago. So far, there have been found 8 nooses hanging in construction sites around the city. So that's some of what Black youth and others encounter. Where we're at this point in time is there's been 165 mentees and 26 peer mentors who've been recruited and are actively in the process of workshops and mentoring and moving into the trades And additionally, the agency has adopted this program as a backbone to what they're doing for labor force pathways, and it's extending it to their 3 other equity groups that they work with. So what are the lessons learned from these stone soup stories as it relates to education? First of all, the construct of power as confronted and experienced needs to be reconstructed and reconfigured. The central and anchoring role of voice, be it parents, college students, elementary students, community, are a keystone feature of the construction of initiatives. Engagement is achieved through a multi-stage transformational relational process. Existing historical and current harms are addressed through building and repairing the future. The creation of ecosystems and community is intentional, often where none have existed before. Education, when infused with the power and voice of community, is altered through a process of mutualism and reciprocity. Resilience is experienced as the ability to adapt within a supportive context that can both fail and feed forward. Abundant diversity is a hallmark feature of inclusive practices. The form of justice demonstrated is racial, economic, and social. Lastly, there needs to be time to till the soil, find champions, plant seeds, water, watch, and harvest. So let me go to the next segment. In my corner of the world, and I would imagine elsewhere, but certainly here, there's a number of significant challenges to education right now. There are calls for transformation, calls for abolition as it exists, and calls to decolonize. So I want to look at 3 spokespersons and some of the quotes and positions that they've marked out for us. Transformation. Anne Lopez is professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, who trains educational leaders and also teachers. One, she says we need to create space for Black people. She highlights that the absence of Black bodies in positions of leadership and teaching is a significant gap. Racism is normal and an ingrained feature of the social fabric of society. For her and many others, racial identity is a site of resistance. And lastly, she seeks transformative change in the quest to improve the lives of Black people. From an abolitionist perspective, somewhat similar to a transformational agenda, but with different nuances, represented by Bettina Love, some of the things that she's written about. In her book, We Want to Thrive, Not Just Survive, she seeks to transform, not reform. She wants schools built on justice, joy, love, and anti-racism. And that she's dreaming and vigorously creating a vision for what schools will be when the educational survival complex is destroyed. From a decolonizing perspective, which comes from Indigenous, First Nations leaders, scholars, writers, Marie Baptiste, who's a Mi'kmaq, writes that she identifies the nature of Eurocentric models of education and their devastating impacts on Aboriginal knowledge. She works for a new model of education and argues that the preservation of Aboriginal knowledge is an Aboriginal right. And she aims to revitalize a knowledge system which incorporates both Indigenous and Eurocentric thinking. Combined together, I think these all converge around a central point, which is that there needs to be fundamental change to education. However, and not maybe just however, it must be noted that as these challenges are offered to education, they've equally been labeled against restorative justice and the calls to make significant changes. Just some of the quotes from Colorizing Restorative Justice. Even those for restorative practices remain less than confident about using its values as tools on a systemic level, a hallmark that shows true commitment to the work. Whites and restorative practices will continue to inflict harm on Black, Indigenous, persons of colors as long as they refuse to develop and apply a race-conscious lens. The belief that we can use restorative approaches within a justice system that has roots in white supremacy alone lies at the heart of how restorative practices and restorative justice has been colonized. Schools and communities that come together for intergenerational conversations around race, class, gender, and community well-being define transformative change. So, if we were to problematize restorative justice in schools, let's look to Tale of Three School Boards and start with a circle in the square. Many years ago, Nancy Ristenberg wrote the book, The Circle in the Square. So how do our circle processes fit into an institution and buildings that are fundamentally not circular in form, nor circular in terms of process and power? But for me, it goes beyond that. What about the community? What about the place where joys, hopes, dreams, futures, gifts, talents, and assets exist? How do we encircle schools with community so that we can build both from the inside out and the outside in? 3 school boards in the GTA have had experiences with restorative justice, human rights, and anti-Black racism up to this very moment. Prior to 2008, zero tolerance policy governed all issues of discipline and conduct in all schools throughout the province. However, there were a variety of human rights actions and challenges to ministry and school boards around the discriminatory practices and the bias that was found to be prevalent in suspensions and expulsions. So the ministry made changes to the policy to be what was called safe and caring policy that included restorative justice as part of progressive discipline. So the focus on addressing suspensions and expulsions and within those departments. Some boards were early adopters prior to the policy, others afterwards because they had to. All were initially trained in the conferencing model and this has had a significant presence in all 3 boards. However, as the Toronto District School Board research report that covers the 12 years beginning in 2006 states, this originated in youth justice, taking the model from youth justice that was being generated at a time of renewal for that particular aspect of the criminal code. This was then the template that was initially brought into schools. And where we're at now in terms of the issues around anti-Black racism is that there's significant issues exist in all 3 boards regarding and not restricted to anti-Black racism, extending through the classroom curriculum, lack of representation in teachers, streaming, discipline, and additionally up to, and in some cases, management's inability and senior admin to address these very issues, which has then led to seeing 2 directors removed, 1 board taken over by the ministry, and requiring 1 school trustee to apologize and calls for another to be removed. Now, I would say at this very point in time, these school boards have all embraced significant and deep cultural strategies to alter this state of affairs. But the question becomes, so what is the role of restorative practices in addressing these issues of anti-Black racism if one is only a variant of a justice model? And where's the community voice? And this is not to say that a number of things done under the banner of restorative justice in schools has not issued benefits. Many colleagues of mine work in those very areas. But what I always go to is there a way that we can come in at these issues so that we're not working somewhere along the pipeline and actually before there's even a pipeline? And not just a sidebar. while there's attention to anti-Black racism is an essential focus during these times and must be, I think we also need to have a broader anti-oppression lens that works for the rights and equity of all: Aboriginals, First Nations, queer youth, those that are neurodiverse, those that are living in poverty. And then we need to be mindful of the intersectional dynamics of identity. So we need to use a broader lens. So it's time to braid some of the sweetgrass. Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote that book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's Potawatomi. She's also a scientist. And the subtitle was Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. What she talks about there, and she talks about many things, is that there's a pluralism of knowledges and suggests that each in their own way, the scientific and the indigenous, have a role to play, but also, particularly when it relates to scientific knowledge, it can be overextended and be guilty of overreach. So what I want to braid together is looking at ecosystems. So there's a number of key components when we look at the world through an ecosystem lens. And these are some of the elements. Niche is the place that is fundamental to a species and where it thrives. Mutualism, which is the reciprocal coevolution of species for the well-being of both. Keystone is that species that plays a unique and central underpinning function in a whole ecosystem. So think of beavers, wolves, wasps, and the converse when they're not there, and typically the cascading, devastating effect on other species, but the actual environment itself. Resilience is the adaptive ability of ecosystems to respond to change positively based on abundant diversity. Ecosystem engineers are species that so modifies its environment that it creates its own niche. And probiosis is working with and for nature and ourselves. It's life-giving. So we need to apply these to the restorative work, and I'll do that at the very end. What I want us to think about then is restorative ecosystems. An ecosystem that actually underpins the variance of our work. We talk about practices, we talk about pedagogy, which is both content and process, and we talk about justice. These need to be bundled together as a restorative ecosystem. Because our work is, if the structure does not permit dialogue or opportunity, the structure must be changed. And I would suggest the fundamental purpose of education is the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And in doing that, I think we need to be mindful and be explicit about transforming our restorative lenses. From an ontological point of view, we need to think of our interrelationship with others. From an epistemological point of view, I think we need to view the world, as many of us do, through relational ways of knowing, embracing feminism, post-human thinking, and constructivist thinking. From an ethical point of view, we need to ground the ethics in an ethics of care that is the basis for our right actions with others. And then from an ecological point of view, we need to think of a permaculture. We need to think of the connectedness of the natural and the built world. So we need to build from the community into education, because this is typically the friction point between schools, school boards, and parents, families, and communities, is that there are not bridges. There are not ways in that are simple. Go back to the school as a hub. We need to build places in, ensure that the community is in the school and not just an add-on. And in the case of the high conflict situations that we have right now, certainly in my jurisdiction, is that we need to listen. And it's not simply hearing what others are saying, but it's giving them space to contribute in a real way. So the community system needs to be seen as a system in its own right, and that we need to acknowledge the lived experience and engage the community while also hearing student voices, and then use an authentic restorative leadership that also grounds inclusive design, curriculum, culturally relevant pedagogy, works towards school climates that support success and well-being, and also embraces a restorative pedagogy, which then allows us to have collective impact through transformation. And this has to be part of an integrated strategy. Restorative practices, restorative justice in and of itself will not achieve significant results unless it's integrated with teaching practices, the curriculum, the classroom, teachers. So we need to walk alongside our fellow education workers. And then I think we need to, because we're talking about complexity, use design thinking, as we taught our students in the Social Innovation Hub. If we want to solve the wicked problems, we need to think differently and beyond silos. So these are three frames I would use around that. One is that we need to think of change as three-dimensional. We need to go out into the wider community. We need to go down into the culture and social norms and up into the political and policy realm. And that, integrating those three perspectives will allow for transformational change. But on the other hand, too, we need to think of using a trauma-informed lens that can help us move from disrupting the effects of trauma, whether from events or systemic harms, to move to places where we can create safe spaces where students can begin to reclaim their bodies, their selves, and acknowledge the unique narratives they bring with them, and address the hurts and harms that exist, and then begin a process of restoration, not only of individuals, but of relationships within the school, between students, teachers, parents, and into the community, which will then move towards transformation. And in that way, we can repair the future. Then lastly, we need to go back to the ecosystems. And remember that a restorative ecosystem is the largest circle of them all. We need to create niches, which is where individuals will thrive and survive, where there is safety for all, and which is the beginning of inclusion. We need to utilize mutualism. There needs to be reciprocity, power sharing, and also identification. Students need to see that those that are teaching them or those that are helping them in restorative endeavors also reflect their own reality. We need to also, colorize and decolonize our restorative practices. We need to have resilience, which is the adaptive response of both restorative and pedagogical efforts. One size doesn't fit all, and we need to customize and individualize what we're doing. Abundant diversity would reflect an anti-oppression lens that allows us to truly embrace a wide and inclusive diversity of voices. And that's where ecosystems are robust, the more diverse they are. We need to look at ourselves as ecosystem engineers, as ones who craft environments, spaces, places, relationships that will allow individuals to thrive. We also need to appreciate that there are champions in the community who are doing the same sort of thing, and align with them and work together and journey along. And then the last thing is we need to remember that the keystone in all of this, like in architecture or in an ecosystem, are relationships. And these are relationships that are ongoing and that are transformational. And fundamentally, it should be embracing an ethic and thoughts of probiosis. It needs to be for life. It needs to be about joy and celebration in our effective lives. And I'm going to end off with this last quote. Oh, I'm going to do this all over again, but that's all right. And I'm going to end off with this last quote from, again, Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a mashup of a few things that she has written in her book. One is she says, time is a circle. It is a turning circle. There is a place where history and prophecy converge. The footprints of the persons who have come before us lie behind us and on the path ahead. What better words to both look back, but more importantly, look towards the future. Thank you for your time. Also, I will put up some of the resources that I've referred to throughout, and if anybody would like to chat at some point, I would love to do that because, as we say, it's one big circle.